Hey, what's going on everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the smallest gaming PC with a dedicated GPU I've ever been able to put together. And yeah, this thing can actually game. It actually puts out some decent performance for the form factor, but before we jump into that, I want to give you a look at how I put this thing together. It's not a build tutorial, I just kind of want to go over what I did to make this work. For the base of the system, I went with a mini PC known as the M6. There's a few different manufacturers that rebrand these, but I've done a video on this in its stock form factor. It's actually an awesome little low-powered PC. The CPU only pulls around 12 watts. It's an Intel Celeron N5105. This model here has 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's soldered down so it's non-user replaceable, but you can also pick one up with 16. But as soon as I pulled the bottom off, I noticed we had a free NVMe M.2 slot. So that's exactly where I'm going to be adding my GPU, and in order to do that, I needed an adapter. This is a PCIe X16 to M.2 adapter. You can pick these up on Amazon. So the M.2 side is going to go to the mini PC. The PCIe X16 is going to have a GPU plugged into it. And when it comes to that graphics card, I used one of my favorites, the GTX 1650. This is the MSI low profile version. And the Celeron CPU in this mini PC is still going to be a bottleneck for this GPU, but I think we can up the graphics performance on this mini PC by quite a bit. Along with that, I had some plastic standoffs laying around. I had a couple little rubber feet, so I figured I could put this thing together and make it look halfway decent, like a mini desktop PC. But one of the most important things when adding a graphics card to anything is power. The GTX 1650 doesn't have a 6-pin connector, but it still needs more power than the M.2 can provide. You just can't run a GPU over that. So to solve this problem, I used a Pico power supply. This runs on 12 volts, it will output up to 150 watts, and I'm just using a 100 watt power supply. You plug it directly into this one port back here and it sends power to that Pico power supply. In turn, it's going to send power to the GPU, and I've totally modified the wiring harness because luckily the M6 mini PC runs on 12 volts, and all I really had to do was add a USB Type-C connector to this wiring harness. That way, we only have one plug from the wall to the Pico power supply, and that's going to power the GPU and the mini PC at the same time. And once it's all together, it looks something like this. Now, there was a few different ways I could go about setting this up, but I kind of wanted that desktop look, so I opted to have the GPU coming right off the side. I used those plastic standoffs to kind of hold it up. Everything is attached to the mini PC, so it's not going to fall apart or anything like that. And we've got a single power cable going to the Pico power supply, which just happens to be mounted underneath the GPU. I used some Kapton tape on the Pico power supply so it doesn't make contact with the GPU, but overall, I think it turned out pretty nicely. Okay, so we've got USB Type-C power for the mini PC itself, HDMI from the GTX 1650 to the monitor, and power to the Pico power supply, which in turn is going to power the GPU and the PC at the same time. Go ahead and boot it up. Got the fan spinning on that GPU. It's going to boot right into Windows for us. So like I mentioned, the CPU is going to hold the GTX 1650 back, but I still want to see what it can do. By the way, I'm running Windows 11 Pro here. Done a couple little tweaks just to get as much RAM as I can because I only have 8 gigs on the mini PC side of things and 4 gigabytes of VRAM with the GTX 1650. Overall, it's a pretty snappy little setup here. Let me open up Task Manager. As you can see, we've got that Celeron N5105. 4 cores, no extra threads. It's got a base clock of 2 GHz and a boost up to 2.9. 8 gigabytes of RAM soldered to the board. Built-in Intel UHD graphics. And of course, the Nvidia GeForce GTX 1650. And with this, we've got 4 gigs of RAM. It's a non-TI variant. It's the low-profile version. I've already installed some games to test out, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. And first up, we went a little old school with it. Original Skyrim 1080p Ultra settings. It's running at 60. I did see it dip down to 58, but I'd never noticed that if I didn't have that FPS counter on. I know it's an older game, but I still love playing it, and seeing it run on this little PC at 1080p Ultra is still pretty impressive. I know we've got a 1650, but the CPU side of things with this is pretty low end. Next up, we've got Forza Horizon 5. We're at 900p low settings, and this is pretty impressive, but I did have to turn VSync on because with VSync off, it was overrunning that CPU and dipping under 60, I mean way under. I don't think it's that bad, and if I didn't have that frame counter on, I really wouldn't notice it, but there was another way I wanted to try this out. I was thinking about taking it to 1080p, high settings, and locking it at 30. And as you can see, it does run quite well like this. Personally, I would rather play this game at 60 FPS, even if I had to go down to low settings 720p, but you know, that's just me. Some people can definitely get by at 30 FPS, and here we are at 1080p high settings. Really not that bad. Next up, we've got the new PC port of God of War, and going into this, I knew that the CPU was going to struggle with this one. We're at 720p low, and really it doesn't change much even if I go up to 1080p low. It really comes down to that CPU just not having enough power. Now, if this was the N6000 instead of the N5105, we wouldn't have any of those dips under 30, but unfortunately they don't make a mini PC like this, at least right now with the N6000, and that's a 15 watt chip instead of a 10 watt chip. Initially, going into The Witcher 3 out in the open, I was really impressed. We were actually in the 80s, but then as soon as it started loading more stuff in, we got some freezes. So I capped the frame rate at 60, and I was still experiencing some of those freeze ups. So what I had to do here was just turn it to 30 FPS, and it actually runs pretty decently. And again, it's all coming down to that CPU. That's the bottleneck with this system, the N5105. It's only running at about 12 watts, we've got 4 cores, no extra threads, and we're only sitting at 2.8 gigahertz on all 4 of those cores.
Slow now, whoa.
Kinda just like God of War, I knew Elden Ring was going to struggle a bit. We're at 720p low, it does require a pretty beefy CPU to get it on up there. This GTX 1650 at 720p low settings with the correct CPU can run this game at a constant 60, but with the way I have this little PC set up right now, we're only getting an average of around 34 FPS. I also tested GTA 5, and it's actually not that bad. We're not quite at 60, we're at 1080p normal settings, and even going down to 720p isn't going to help out with this one. We're getting an average of around 52 FPS, but with VSync on, it'll get rid of all of that frame tearing, and it doesn't feel that bad on this little system. And the final game I tested here, Cyberpunk 2077, of course it's not going to run it well, I just wanted to see what it would do. 720p, low settings, no resolution scale going on whatsoever, crowd density is set to low, and that's what really helped it out. With crowd density set to high, I was only getting around 18 FPS, but as soon as I dropped that down, we got an average of 29 FPS, so close to 30, but not quite there. Obviously, we've got a big CPU bottleneck when it comes to this low-end Celeron CPU, but to see this running some of those games actually really well, even at 1080p 30, really isn't that bad for such a small form factor mini PC. Now, one thing I probably would change with this whole setup is just adding a GT 1030 to it. The 1650 is definitely overkill, and I think the GT 1030 might be a little overkill for the CPU, but it would make more sense because there's a lot more we can get out of this GTX 1650 in another rig. Factoring in the low CPU performance, and going into this I knew it wasn't going to be great, I still think it turned out pretty cool. I really love these little rigs here, and the first question I always get is why, and it really comes down to because we can. This is not practical whatsoever. I wouldn't suggest going out and buying something like this and turning it into your main gaming rig. But as you saw in this video, it is possible. So if you like tinkering around with these little mini PCs, or if you got one laying around, I'll leave some links to everything I used in the description. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. Really appreciate you watching. Let me know what you think about this little PC in the comments below. And like always, thanks for watching.